The Suvian captain's voice was absolutely calm when he reported what his ship had found. And that calm was the most frightening thing Commander Nora Vasquez had heard in 22 years of deep space service. She had been at her desk in the Pathfinder's command section, working through survey reports when the transmission came in, and she had almost let it go to the duty officer's queue, because transmission traffic from the distant reach was usually routine, catalog updates and navigational data, and the occasional personnel note from Thuron Vale, who had a habit of passing along things he found interesting without editorial comment, just the data itself, which Nora appreciated because it was her own habit too. But the transmission was flagged priority, and she took it herself, and Thuron's voice came through the speaker with the particular quality of someone who had arrived at calm through a process rather than starting there. He described the object. He described it the way a careful man describes something he was not yet ready to characterize, with measurements and material composition readings and location coordinates, and the dating estimate from his geological survey team, each piece of data delivered without interpretation, without the framing that would have told her what to feel about it. She listened, and she wrote nothing down because she was listening too hard to write. Size, fleet carrier class. Location, 400 kilometers beyond the galactic rim, in the intergalactic void where the deep time stability of empty space maintained temperatures within a degree of absolute zero, and where nothing built by any known civilization had any reason to be. Material composition, consistent with no known alien civilization's construction methodology. Age estimate, 40,000 years plus or minus 300. Structural integrity, complete. Power signature, dormant but present. Evidence of impact damage, environmental degradation, or structural compromise, none. He paused at the end of the data. The pause was 6 seconds, which from Thuron was an essay. Then he said, "There are markings on the hull. My xenolinguist has been unable to categorize them. I am transmitting the visual feed." Nora opened the visual feed. She looked at it for a while. The hull of the object filled the frame of the distant reach's external camera, close enough that individual surface details were visible, close enough that the markings Thuron had mentioned were legible. She heard Omar Hassan come into the command section behind her. He was always there when something was happening, some instinct that had kept him at the right place at the right time for 20 years of working together, and she heard him stop when he saw what was on her screen. Omar said quietly, "Nora, are those?" "Yes," she said. "That ship is 40,000 years old." "I know." She heard him exhale. She heard, after a moment, the faint sound of his hand touching the breast pocket of his uniform, the small, unconscious gesture that she had learned over 20 years to read as precisely as an instrument reading. She looked at the visual feed for another moment, at the markings on a hull that had been sitting in the intergalactic void for 40,000 years, at the letters she could read as easily as her own name because they were in her own language, in the style she had seen on every naval vessel she had served on, in the format she had memorized the first week of her naval training 29 years ago. USS Eternal Watch. And below it the registry designation, CVS-7. "Plot a course," she said, "maximum speed." It took 22 hours to reach the coordinates. 22 hours during which Nora read everything in the Council's database about the intergalactic void, and found nothing that explained what she was going to find there, and read everything in Earth's deep space records about any vessel designation beginning with USS, and found no record of any vessel called the Eternal Watch under any hull number, and sat with Omar in the small briefing room off the main corridor, and they went through the visual feed together frame by frame, and did not speak much because neither of them had the words for what they were looking at. The visual feed showed the hull clearly. The letters were not pictographs that resembled letters. They were not symbolic representations that could be interpreted as letters through a specific cultural lens. They were letters. Roman alphabet, Navy standard block lettering, the exact typeface that the United States Navy had standardized in the mid-20th century, and that had propagated through Earth's naval design culture until it became simply the way naval vessels looked. There was no interpretation required. There was no possibility of coincidence. A 40,000-year-old ship had the name of a human naval vessel painted on its hull in modern English. Omar said around hour 14, "There is an explanation." "There are several possible explanations," Nora said. "None of them are small." "No," she agreed, "none of them are small." She slept for 4 hours because she had learned the discipline of sleeping when sleep was available regardless of what was happening, because the situations in which sleep was most difficult to achieve were precisely the situations in which being rested was most important. She dreamed of nothing she could remember and woke up clear-headed and went back to the command section and watched the coordinates grow closer on the navigation display. The Pathfinder dropped out of transit, and Nora saw the USS Eternal Watch for the first time with her own eyes, and the visual feed had not prepared her for it in the way that visual feeds never fully prepared you for scale. It was enormous, not the largest ship she had ever seen. The Council's capital ships exceeded it in sheer mass, but large in the way of something designed without apology for what it needed to be, sized for the function and not for the impression. Fleet Carrier class, which meant it was built to carry aircraft and support vessels, and the logistics of extended operations far from any base, which meant it was built for the specific understanding that you might be very far from help for a very long time, and you needed to be sufficient unto yourself for the duration. The hull was the gray dark of every human naval vessel she had ever served on, not painted, she understood, but the natural color of the alloy, the same choice of material that human engineers had converged on independently across her own civilization's history, and that the people who built this ship had arrived at through whatever path had led them here. The lines of it were unmistakably human, not in the sense that she was finding humanity in something alien because she needed it to be familiar, in the sense that the design logic was transparent to her in the way that design logic was only transparent when you shared the underlying assumptions. The placement of the sensor arrays, positioned for maximum coverage with minimum structural interference. The angle of the hull sections where they met, calculated for structural integrity under the stress loads of combat maneuvering. The arrangement of the hangar bay openings along the lower hull, 4 of them, spaced in the pattern that human carrier design had settled on through a century of iteration. Everything said the same thing. The people who built this ship and the people who had built every ship Nora had served on had started from the same place and arrived at the same conclusions through the same reasoning. They were human. Whatever else they were or had been or had become in the 40,000 years since they built this ship and sent it here, they had been human when they built it. The distant reach was holding position 50 kilometers off the carrier's port side. Thuron Vale opened a channel the moment the Pathfinder dropped out of transit, and his voice had the same quality it had carried in the initial transmission. Calm arrived at through process, the calm of someone who had spent 22 hours sitting with something impossible and had reached a stable relationship with the impossibility. "Commander Vasquez," he said, "I believe you recognize the markings." "Yes," she said. "Can you explain them?" No. She looked at the Eternal Watch on her main screen, at the name on the hull, at the registry number below it. "But I intend to find out." There was a pause that she read as appreciation. Thuron Vale had been exploring the outer reaches of known space for 30 years, and he had the quality of someone whose long exposure to the unknown had made them comfortable with not knowing, and she thought he recognized a similar quality in her. "I would like to join you," he said, "if that is acceptable." "Get your shuttle ready," she said. The boarding party was 6 people, Nora and Omar, Lieutenant Kim, her senior sensor specialist, who approached everything with the focused attention of someone who understood that what instruments showed you was only a beginning. Ensign Reyes, her youngest crew member and her best systems analyst, 24 years old with quick hands and quicker processing. Thuron himself, who had brought one member of his own crew, a Suvian engineer named Vale 3 who was apparently not related to Thuron despite the name, and who spoke very little but observed everything. They approached the boarding hatch in the forward section. The hatch was identifiable as a hatch by its outline and its positioning, which followed the same logic as every carrier hatch Nora had used in 22 years. There was no visible control panel, no keypad, no biometric scanner of the kind she knew. There was a flat surface beside the hatch, palm-sized, slightly recessed, positioned at exactly the height where a human hand would naturally rest. Nora looked at it. She looked at the hatch. She looked at the name on the hull above them, the letters large enough to be read clearly at this range, painted by someone who was either human or had known humans well enough to build for them in every detail. She put her hand on the flat surface. The hatch opened. Not immediately. There was a 2-second pause that felt like something assessing, like something that had been waiting and was now confirming. Then the hatch opened inward in the way that carrier hatches opened, into a pressurization vestibule, and the vestibule sealed behind them, and then the inner hatch opened, and the eternal watch received them. It was dark for the first 3 seconds, not the absolute dark of a ship with dead power. There was a faint residual luminescence from the walls themselves, some property of the material that suggested the ship was not entirely without energy, but was conserving what it had with the patience of something that understood it might need to conserve for a long time. Then the lights came on. Not emergency lighting, not the red dimmed minimal output of a ship on reserve power. Full operational lighting, the kind you brought up when the ship was inhabited, when people were working and living in its corridors and needed to see clearly. It came on section by section, spreading from the vestibule outward through the visible corridors in both directions. And with it, the temperature began to rise, the life support system engaging with the quiet efficiency of something that had been maintaining minimal function for 40,000 years and was now releasing into full operation. The air that came with it was cold and clean and smelled of nothing, except the particular absence of smell that very old enclosed spaces acquired, when everything biological had long since finished whatever process it had to finish, and what remained was simply the chemical neutrality of materials that had outweighed everything else. Omar had his scanner out and was not looking up from it. Nora could see from the quality of his attention that he was seeing things that were adding up to something he was not yet ready to say. The corridors were human, not approximately human, not compatible with human use. Human. The width was calculated for human shoulder width, the same calculation that naval vessel corridors had used for over a century. The height cleared Nora's head by the same margin she was used to. The handrails were at the height human hands reached when human arms hung at their sides. The angle of the overhead panels, slightly curved toward the center, was the same configuration that human designers had arrived at for its combination of structural integrity and light distribution. They were walking through a ship built by people who were her size and her shape, and who had made the same choices her civilization's designers had made, arrived at through whatever path they had walked for however long they had walked it, ending at the same place. They reached the bridge in 12 minutes of corridor travel, and the bridge was exactly what a human carrier bridge should look like. Nora stood in the hatchway and looked at it and did not move for a moment, because the bridge was doing something to her that she needed a moment to process. It was not awe exactly. It was recognition. The command chair in the center of the bridge, positioned for sight lines to every station. The navigation station forward and slightly below the command level, angled for easy reading of trajectory data. The tactical station to port with its arrangement of overlapping display surfaces. The engineering readout to starboard, the screens dark now but positioned where an engineer standing watch would naturally look. Every station, every console, every detail of layout said the same thing the corridors said. human, entirely and precisely and unmistakably human. The screens came alive as they entered, the same automatic response as the lighting and the life support, and on the main command screen, the largest display, centered and clear. Awaiting crew. Duration, 39,847 years, 214 days, 6 hours. Omar touched the pocket. Just once briefly, the way he did when the situation had moved into territory he was still measuring. Nora walked to the command chair and stood beside it. She did not sit in it yet. That was a decision she was going to make when she understood more about what the decision meant. Kim, she said, full sensor sweep of the ship. I want a complete structural map before we move beyond this deck. She looked at Omar. Engineering systems, everything you can get. Already running, Omar said, not looking up. She looked at Thuron, who was standing at the forward viewport looking out at the intergalactic void that the Eternal Watch had been sitting in for 40,000 years. The void was absolute in a way that the space within the galaxy was not. No stars, no nebulae, no light except the distant river of the galaxy behind them, faint and cold at this distance, like a memory of light. Thuron turned from the viewport. His expression was the expression of someone who had been in this situation before, the situation of standing in the presence of something that was reshaping his understanding of the universe, and who had enough experience with it to be with it rather than against it. It was waiting, he said, not just dormant, waiting. Yes, Nora said. For how long would it have waited? Nora looked at the screen. Duration, 39,847 years, 214 days, 6 hours. I think the answer is as long as necessary, she said. I think that was the design. They spent 6 hours exploring the ship in the systematic way that Nora had learned to explore unknown spaces, section by section, documenting everything, moving through each deck in sequence before moving to the next. 6 hours of finding things that added to the picture that was assembling itself in pieces, each piece clear, and the whole still too large to hold at once. The hangar bay was in the lower decks, 4 bays corresponding to the 4 external hatches she had noted on approach, each one large enough for the atmospheric vessels they contained. There were 64 of them, sealed in preservation housings that the ship's systems had maintained at the same condition they had been in when they were placed there, however long ago that was. Each vessel was marked on its housing with a name in the same naval lettering as the hull. Nora walked the length of the first bay reading the names on the housings, and something tightened in her chest with each one. Kansas City, New Orleans, Brisbane, Cape Town, Nairobi, Oslo, Guadalajara, Jakarta, 64 vessels, 64 cities, every vessel named for a place on Earth, the Earth that existed now, the Earth that had been a primitive planet 40,000 years ago when these names were chosen by people who had predicted it well enough to name 64 atmospheric vessels after its cities. They had known. Whoever built this ship had known that the Earth they were building for would have cities, would have this many cities worth naming, would have humans in it who would recognize the names and understand what the naming meant. They had built that prediction into the ship itself, into the smallest details of the naming, and they had been right. Omar found her in the 3rd hangar bay, standing in front of the housing labeled Wellington, and he stood beside her and read the names on the nearby housings and was quiet. They knew us, he said finally. They knew us and they had never met us. They knew what we would be, Nora said, because they knew what they had been. The cargo holds took 2 hours to document because they were extensive, and because every section of them contained something that required attention. Supplies in preservation housings that had maintained them at the condition they were placed in. Food stocks, enough to establish and sustain a colony for years. Medical supplies in quantities and varieties that Kim cross-referenced against current human pharmaceutical standards and found, with an expression of careful wonder, to be largely compatible, different formulations, different delivery methods, but targeting the same biological systems with the same underlying understanding of human physiology. Construction materials, equipment, everything you would need if you were arriving somewhere that had nothing and needed to build something. They had filled the ship for colonists, for the humans who would eventually come to claim it. They had thought of everything and brought it and preserved it and waited 40,000 years for someone to use it. The crew quarters were on the mid-decks, corridor after corridor of cabin doors that opened when Nora put her hand to them, each cabin sized and furnished for a human being who would need a place to sleep, and a place to keep their things, and a small amount of space that was theirs alone in the way that space on ships was always negotiated between necessity and privacy. Most of the cabins were empty. The personal effects in the ones that were not had been left, with the deliberateness of people who understood they were leaving them for a purpose. In one cabin she found books, physical books in a script she could not read, stacked on the desk with the care of someone who valued them, with small objects between them that she understood were markers even if she could not read the script. In another cabin there was a collection of small stones, smooth and varied in color, the kind of collection someone made when they spent time in beautiful places and wanted to carry something of them. In another there were tools, small, precise, the tools of someone who made things with their hands, laid out in the order of use the way craftspeople laid out their tools. In the cabin at the end of the third corridor on deck 7, she found the drawing. It was pinned to the wall beside the bunk, at the height where someone lying in the bunk could see it without moving. A child's drawing, in whatever medium they had used that had survived 40,000 years in preservation conditions, on a piece of material that was not quite paper but served the same purpose. A house with a sloped roof. A tree beside the house, round-crowned, the way children drew trees when they had not yet learned that trees were more complicated than that. Two figures standing in front of the house, one tall and one small. The tall one's arm curved around the small one's shoulders in the universal posture of a person holding a person they loved. Nora stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at it for a long time. The person who had put it there had known they were leaving, had known they were putting their cabin in order one final time before they gave it to a ship that was going somewhere they could not follow, had chosen to leave the drawing on the wall instead of taking it because they understood that the drawing going forward mattered more than the drawing staying with them. They had given it to the ship the way they had given everything else, as a gift for strangers, as a trust that strangers were coming and would deserve it. She found Omar in the corridor when she stepped back out. He looked at her face and at the open cabin door and at the drawing visible from where he stood, and he said nothing. He had learned over 20 years that there were things she needed to say and things she needed to be with, and this was the second kind. The archive was what Omar found in the 7th hour, in the lower deck section that the ship's internal directory, which had come online with everything else, and was in a hybrid of its builder's script and modern English, navigable by Nora without translation assistance, listed simply as records. He called her in from the hangar bay, where she had been standing in front of the Wellington housing for the third time. The archive room was small and centrally located in the records section, ringed with storage systems that her scanner identified as containing data volumes she could not immediately quantify. And at the center of the room, a single-access terminal that came alive when she sat down in front of it with the same quality of response the rest of the ship had shown, immediate, complete, oriented toward her as if it had been designed with her specifically in mind, which it had not. Which it had in a way that she was beginning to understand. She started with what she needed to start with, which was the simplest available explanation for what she was looking at. She searched for the ship's operational records, the logs that would document where the Eternal Watch had been and when and who had commanded it. The operational records were there. They were brief. The Eternal Watch had been constructed at a location she could not map to any current coordinate system, had been loaded with its cargo over a period of years, had conducted one voyage to the current location, and had entered dormancy at the coordinates. It currently occupied on a date that the archive's internal calendar converted to approximately 40,000 years before the current date, using the Galactic Standard Calendar. The crew who had brought it here had disembarked at the current location. The archive did not say how. It said simply, "Crew disembarkation complete. Duration of voyage, 4 years, 2 months, 17 days. Mission status, complete." They had brought it here and left it here and gone wherever they had gone, and the ship had waited. She went to the project records next. Project Continuance was not a military operation. The designation at the top of the documentation was not a mission classification of the kind she was familiar with from her own service records. It was something closer to what she would have called a foundation document, the statement of purpose at the beginning of a very long project, setting out what the project was and why it existed and what it hoped to accomplish. She read it once quickly, and then from the beginning again slowly. 40,000 years ago, by the archive's timeline, there had been a human civilization, not the humanity of today. Something that had developed along a path that diverged from the path that had produced Nora Vasquez and Omar Hassan and Gerald Akafer and every other human in the known galaxy at some point in deep prehistory. A branch that had gone in a different direction for long enough to reach the stars before the branch that was today's humanity had reached the concept of writing things down. Different journey, different history, different capabilities, but human in the fundamental sense, human in their values and their fears and their hopes, and the way they had approached every problem their long existence had given them, which was with stubbornness and curiosity and grief and love, and the refusal to accept that they were finished when something tried to finish them. They had reached the end. Not through war, not through catastrophe, not in the way that Nora had assumed when she began reading, not through the dramatic external ending that civilizations in council history most often met. The archive was specific about this, and the specificity mattered. They had reached the end through something they called the dimming, which the medical records described in terminology that Nora could not fully translate because the medical language was old and technical, and her translation assistants could only approximate, but which described through every approximation a gradual and irreversible loss of something biological, something in the mechanism of reproduction, something in the continuity of life-making itself. That had begun as a rarity and had become a norm and had finally become simply what they were. The last generation was already born. They had known it for decades before the archive was written. They had spent those decades trying to find a solution, and the solutions had not come. What had come instead was the understanding that they were ending, that the question was no longer whether but what they did with the time they had, what they chose to be in the ending. Project Continuance was what they chose. Nora read through the documentation in sequence, section by section, the way she read everything that mattered, without skipping ahead, without looking for the conclusion before she had the foundation. She read about the construction of the Eternal Watch, which had been the work of decades, and the contribution of resources that an ending civilization had decided were better spent on this than on anything else available to spend them on. She read about the selection of cargo, the debates about what to bring, what would be most valuable to people who had never existed yet, and whose needs could only be modeled and predicted and trusted. The arguments about food versus equipment versus medical supplies versus knowledge, and the eventual conclusion that the answer was all of it, as much as could be fitted, because they did not know what would be most needed, and so they chose not to guess. She read about the navigation calculations that had identified the intergalactic void as the optimal location for 40,000-year preservation, the deep time stability of empty space being the one available guarantee against the slow deteriorations that galactic environments imposed. She read about the letter. The letter was noted in the project records as the final document of Project Continuance, written by a committee and revised by another committee and revised again by a third, and then ultimately rewritten by one person whose name she could not read in the archive's script, but whose voice came through the translation clearly enough. The voice of someone who had decided that the committee drafts were saying the correct things in the wrong way and who had started over. She navigated to the letter. She read the opening. She read it again. She reached for her comm and then stopped, because this was something she needed to do alone first, and she said to Omar and Thuron and the others who were in the archive room with her, "I need a few minutes." She heard Omar stand up. She heard Thuron's slight movement toward the door. She heard the door close. She read the letter. It was long. It covered the history of Project Continuance, which she had already read in the project documentation, and which read differently here, from the inside of someone who had been part of it, with the texture of lived experience rather than institutional record. It covered the dimming in language that was more personal than the medical records had been, more honest about what it had felt like to watch something they had no power over proceed at its own pace, regardless of everything they tried. It covered the debates about what to do with the time they had, and the decision that had emerged from those debates, not unanimously, not without significant dissent from people who felt the resources of a civilization should be spent on its living members rather than its hypothetical successors, and the eventual convergence on the understanding that those things were not mutually exclusive, and that Project Continuance was not a replacement for caring for the living but a parallel act. Near the middle it said, "We have modeled the emergence of a successor humanity as best our science allows. The models agree on certain things. They agree that it will be human. They agree on certain fundamental qualities that our long history suggests are not cultural but constitutive: the stubbornness, the curiosity, the attachment to other individuals that you experience as love and that we have experienced as love, and that something in the biology of what we both are seems to make inevitable. The models agree on these things. They disagree on almost everything else, which is to say they agree that what you will be in your particulars is beyond prediction, and we have tried to build for the particulars we could not predict by building for the fundamentals we could." Near the end it said, "We do not know if you will be ready for this ship when you find it, or what ready would mean for you, or what you will do with what is here. We have tried to leave you resources without leaving you obligations, choices without constraints, a foundation without a blueprint. What you build on it is yours. We have no claim on that, and we want no claim on it. What we wanted was to give you the thing that was hardest to give ourselves in the ending, which was the understanding that what was coming after us was not nothing, that the fact of our ending did not mean the end of what we had been, that human was not over just because we were." The last paragraph said, "We would have liked to meet you. We would have liked to know what 40,000 years made of the stubbornness and the curiosity and the love. We think it made something worth meeting. We think that because we know what we were and we know that what we were was worth meeting, and you are what we became, given time, and time has been very long. Take the ship, go where it takes you, do what humans do. We would have liked to meet you." Nora sat in the archive room of the USS Eternal Watch and held that last sentence for a long time. She was not crying. She was doing something that was not crying and was in some ways harder, the kind of processing that happened below the level of tears, in the place where things that were too large for the immediate emotional vocabulary landed and slowly settled into the longer understanding. She thought about Sarah, her co-pilot, dead 12 years in an accident that had not needed to happen, on an ordinary training day, in equipment that had been flagged for replacement on a timeline that had not aligned with the need. She thought about the 12 years since and the way she had moved through them, doing the work, being present for her crew, carrying the thing that you carried when someone you loved died in a way that did not need to happen, and you were the one still living. She thought about the child's drawing pinned to the wall in the cabin on Deck 7. The person who had put it there had been in the same position. In a way, they were leaving, and the person who had made the drawing was staying, or was already gone, and they had taken the drawing with them anyway in the only way available to them, which was to put it on the wall of a ship that was going forward and trust the forward to carry it. She thought about what it meant that the last thing an ending civilization had done was not grieve and not rage and not spend its final resources on itself, but build. That the decision made in the face of ending had been to make something for the people who were coming, to give rather than to take, to trust rather than to despair. That was, she thought, a very human thing to do. She was still sitting with it when the command channel opened. She would learn later that the escort had arrived early by 3 hours because that was what Admiral Das Morin's escorts did. Because Morin was a man who believed that arriving early was a statement of priority, and that priority was the correct way to establish jurisdiction. And he was not wrong about that in the way that people who were wrong about the most important thing were often not wrong about everything else. He was a precise and capable military administrator, and his analysis of the situation was precise and capable and completely correct within the frame he was using, and the frame was wrong. The channel opened on the Pathfinder's main frequency, and his voice was the voice of a man who had reviewed the situation documentation and arrived at conclusions, and was communicating those conclusions with the efficiency of someone who considered the communication a formality. Commander Vasquez, this is Admiral Das Morin, Suvian Military Command. The vessel currently under your examination was discovered in intergalactic space by the Suvian exploration vessel Distant Reach, and is therefore subject to Suvian Military Command jurisdiction under the Galactic Council's Intergalactic Discovery Protocols, Article 7, Subsection 4. He paused the way people paused when they were giving the other party time to acknowledge rather than time to respond. I expect the current situation to be handled in an orderly manner. A Suvian military escort is holding at your position. Please stand by for formal inventory procedures. Nora was still in the archive room. She heard the transmission through the room speakers, and she looked at the access terminal in front of her and at the letter on the screen, and she made the decision she had been moving toward since the archive room door closed and Omar and Thuron stepped out. She stood up. She opened the archive room door. Omar and Thuron were in the corridor, both of them having heard the transmission through their comm units, both of them looking at her with the expressions of people waiting to understand what came next. She looked at Thuron. I have to tell you something about what is in the archive. She looked at Omar. And I have something I need you to do. She told Thuron about Project Continuance. She told him the way she always told things that mattered, factually and without performance, standing in the corridor of a 40,000-year-old ship, with the transmission from Morin still live on the channel and the archive behind her and the decision already made. She told him about the dimming. She told him about what the builders had chosen to do with the time they had. She told him about the letter, which she did not recite but described, and she watched his face while she described it, and his face said the thing she had thought it would say. The thing she had known when she asked Thuron specifically, and not some other Suvian captain to come with her when the Distant Reach first reported the Eternal Watch. He was quiet for a long moment after she finished. They built it for you, he said. They built it for whoever came, she said. It happened to be us. He looked at the corridor wall, at the human design of it, the proportions, the materials, the choices made by people 40,000 years ago for people they would never meet. Something moved in his expression that she identified, after a moment, as the thing that happened to people with long experience of the unknown when they encountered something that reorganized their understanding at the foundation. Not shock, accommodation. The settling of new understanding into a framework that was expanding to hold it. What do you need from me? He said. She told him. To Omar she gave the engineering task, which he had already begun calculating before she finished asking, because Omar had been in the archive too, and he had been reading the engineering records in the hours since, and he knew the ship's systems the way he knew every ship's systems he had worked on, which was from the inside, from the logic that had produced them. from the understanding that engineering was not an arbitrary set of choices, but a coherent language, and that human engineering spoke a dialect he was fluent in. She went back to the channel. She acknowledged Morin's transmission with the professional courtesy of someone who intended to respond substantively later and was managing the timeline of the response. Then she opened the ship-wide channel. "All crew of the Pathfinder," she said. "This is Commander Vasquez. I need volunteers for a transfer. I am taking command of the USS Eternal Watch effective immediately." She paused. "I will not order anyone to join me. This is not an order. What I can tell you is what this ship is and why I am doing this." She told them. Not everything, not the letter in full, not the hour in the archive room, but what the ship was, what Project Continuance had been, what 40,000 years of waiting meant, and who had waited and why. She said, "I am doing this because 40,000 years ago people who were ending chose to spend the time they had left on something for people they would never meet. They chose to give rather than to grieve. I think that deserves to be honored by people who can honor it, and I think we are the people who can." She paused. "Give me your answers in the next 10 minutes." 63 crew members of the Pathfinder gave her their answers in 4 minutes. 63 yes. She stood in the corridor of the Eternal Watch and looked at the transfer count on her comm and thought about the decision each of those 63 people had just made in 4 minutes, in the way that people made decisions when the decision was clear, when the reason was sufficient, when the thing being asked was large but the thing it was being asked for was larger. Thuron's voice on the channel quietly after the 63rd answer registered. "Commander Vasquez, the Distant Reach has a crew of 41. We have 63 invitations in our queue. I would like to discuss a joint crewing arrangement." She almost smiled. She did not quite smile because there was still a great deal to do and smiling was for after. "Get over here," she said. The USS Eternal Watch came fully alive with over 100 crew aboard for the first time in 40,000 years. Nora felt it the way she always felt it when a ship went from dormant to inhabited. The quality of the air changed. The sound changed. The pressure of human presence in corridors and compartments and bays changed the nature of the space. The Eternal Watch had been designed for a crew, and it had been waiting for a crew, and now it had one, and the ship knew it in whatever sense a ship knew such things. In the sense that every system ran slightly more fluidly than it had when they were only a boarding party of 6. Omar's voice from the engineering section had a quality she had heard from him exactly twice in 20 years, which was the quality of a person who had encountered something that exceeded their best expectations in exactly the direction they most hoped for. "Nora," he said, "she is beautiful. I have never in my career seen engineering like this. These people, the choices they made, every system, every redundancy, every decision about where to put what and how to connect it, it is all exactly right. Not right as in functional, right as in they understood what they were building and they loved it while they built it." "They had a reason to love it," Nora said. "They had love. That is what this engineering looks like. These people built this ship with love and you can feel it in every connection." She was in the corridor outside the bridge when he said it, and she stood there for a moment and felt the truth of it. The way you felt the truth of something that your instruments could not measure, but that was real regardless. The Eternal Watch had been built with love, not sentimentally. In the practical sense that the people who built it had cared about the outcome, had cared about the humans who would eventually need it, had cared enough to get every detail right, had spent decades and the resources of an ending civilization on the caring and the getting right. She walked onto the bridge. She walked to the command chair. She stood beside it for a moment as she had stood beside it when they first boarded, before she had read the project documentation and the letter and understood what the decision to sit in this chair meant. She sat down. The ship responded immediately. In the same instant her weight settled into the chair, every display coming fully alive, every system status showing on the screens that surrounded the command position in the configuration she had always found intuitive and now understood why. It was the configuration that made sense, the configuration that human commanders had arrived at through a century of iteration, and that the builders of the Eternal Watch had arrived at through a century of their own. The main command screen changed from the dormancy counter it had been displaying since they boarded. It filled with the ship's operational status. Every system, every readiness indicator, every capability the Eternal Watch had been maintaining at readiness for 40,000 years in case this moment came. At the top of the display, where the ship's designation and status header appeared in every Navy vessel she had ever commanded, the Eternal Watch said, "Crew aboard. Duration, 39,847 years, 214 days, 17 hours. Welcome home." Nora looked at it for a moment. She breathed. She thought about 40,000 years, about the people who had made this ship ready and then left it to wait, trusting that the waiting would end the way they hoped, trusting the models and the math and something that was not quite faith but lived in the same neighborhood. Then Morin's escort opened the channel again, and she had work to do. She did not argue with Morin. She did not confront his jurisdictional position or challenge the protocol he had cited or make the case for why Article 7, Subsection 4, did not apply to a vessel with a human crew aboard a human ship that had been built for humans by humans. She transmitted the archive. All of it, every file. The project documentation, the medical records, the engineering logs, the crew records, the cargo manifests, the navigation calculations, the final voyage log. And the letter. She transmitted it to Morin's channel. She transmitted it to every council member simultaneously. To every delegation, every monitoring post, the council's public record, every corner of the network that had the bandwidth to receive it. The complete archive of Project Continuance, 40,000 years old, from a civilization that no longer existed to a galaxy that had never known it existed. She did not add anything. She did not frame it or contextualize it or advocate for any particular interpretation. The archive said everything that needed to be said, and the letter said it in the way that it most needed to be said, which was in the voice of someone who had been there, who had made the choice, who had known what the choice cost and made it anyway. 4 hours. The Eternal Watch and the Suvian military escort held position in the void, and Nora ran crew integration protocols, and Omar ran system checks, and Thuron's people learned the ship's corridors alongside Nora's people, and the ship continued waking up, continued finding its full operational register, continued being exactly what it had been built to be. 4 hours, then Morin's channel opened. His voice was the same voice, professional, controlled, exact. But something was different underneath the professional control. Some quality that the 4 hours of reading had introduced into the man who had transmitted the first message, and that was not in the man who was transmitting now. "Commander Vasquez," he said, "the Suvian military command is withdrawing its jurisdictional claim to the vessel designated USS Eternal Watch." A pause. "The archive materials have been reviewed by military command and transmitted to the Suvian Council for the record." Another pause that had something in it she could feel without being able to name. "The letter has been reviewed." The longest pause. "Whatever that ship is, Commander, it is yours." His voice was exactly what it had always been, and something underneath it was different from what it had ever been. It was always yours. The Eternal Watch returned to known space under its own power for the first time in 40,000 years, and the drive that Omar had declared beautiful performed at exactly the specifications it had been built to, which were specifications that exceeded the Pathfinder's capabilities in ways that Omar spent the transit documenting with the focused joy of an engineer who had found something that taught him things. The Galactic Council convened a special session for the first time in 20 years, not for a crisis, not for a territorial dispute or a treaty negotiation or any of the ordinary business of the Council's existence, for the archive, for Project Continuance, for the letter from an ending humanity to the humanity that would follow. Every civilization represented in the council had something in its history that corresponded to the question the letter raised, the question of what you did when you knew you were ending, the question of what you chose to give, and what you chose to carry, and what you trusted the future to do with what you gave it. They read the letter through those histories, and they understood it each in their own way, and what they understood, in common across all the differences, was something that they had not had words for before the letter gave it to them. That humanity had been here before, that the universe had had humans in it for a very long time, that whatever quality of stubbornness and curiosity and refusal to be finished that the humans of today carried was not new, was not 60 years old, was not the product of faster-than-light drives and the galaxy's sudden awareness of a new species. It was 40,000 years old at minimum. It was whatever had come before that, the deep history of a lineage that had reached the stars and then ended, and then reached the stars again through a different branch of the same stubborn, curious, loving thing. Nora's statement to the council was short. She had drafted it 3 times on the transit and deleted the drafts because drafting was the wrong process for something that should come from where it actually lived rather than from the part of her brain that drafted things. She stood at the speaker's position in the council chamber and said what was true. The people who built that ship are gone. We cannot know them. We cannot thank them. We cannot give back to them the generations they spent on a gift for strangers or tell them that it arrived or let them know that we found it and understood what it was. She paused. What we can do is be worth it. That is the only thing we can do. It is enough. The council's record note from that session, which appeared in every subsequent reference to the Eternal Watch in every civilization's historical database, noted the statement as definitive. Scholars argued for years about what definitive meant in this context. Most eventually concluded that it meant the statement had said the true thing in the exact form the true thing required, and that there was nothing to add. The Eternal Watch was refitted over 2 years, not rebuilt. Refitted, which was a different operation, which meant the 40,000-year-old engineering was preserved wherever preservation was possible and updated only where integration with modern systems required it. Omar oversaw the refit with the care of someone who understood that he was working on something that was not only a ship. He cataloged every system before touching it. He documented every original design choice before making a change. He wrote a technical record of the Eternal Watch's engineering that became a standard reference in human ship design for the following generation, not because the specific technologies were directly applicable, but because the design philosophy was, the way the builders had thought about every problem, the way they had made choices that prioritized the humans who would use the ship over the elegance of the engineering itself, the way they had built for the reality of human need, rather than the ideal of human capability. The 64 atmospheric vessels in the hangar bay were maintained exactly as they were found. The preservation housings were updated with modern systems, but the vessels themselves were untouched, named for the Earth cities their builders had predicted well enough to name them, waiting for the landings they had always been intended for. The crew quarters were occupied by Nora's people and Thuron's volunteers, and the cabins that had personal effects in them were kept as they were, because Nora had made a decision before the Eternal Watch left the intergalactic void that those cabins were not available for habitation, or for use as storage space, or for any purpose other than what they already served, which was the purpose of being exactly what they were, the belongings of people who had known they were leaving and had left them anyway. As part of the gift, as part of the trust, the child's drawing stayed on the wall of the cabin on Deck 7. Nora visited it sometimes, not on a schedule, not as a practice she had formalized. She found herself there occasionally, in the way she found herself in certain places when something was working through her, when the processing that happened below the level of words needed a location. She stood in the doorway and looked at the drawing, the house, the tree, the 2 figures, one tall and one small, the tall one's arm curved around the small one's shoulders, and she thought about the person who had pinned it there and the moment of pinning, what they had been thinking, whether they had stood in the cabin for a moment afterward and looked at it the way she was looking at it now. She thought they had. She thought the leaving had required a moment of standing and looking, the acknowledgement of what was being left and why and for whom, even if the who was uncertain and the 40,000 years was only a number, and the people on the other side of the number were entirely beyond imagining. She thought they had stood in the doorway and looked at the drawing and then left, because the ship was waiting, and the thing they had spent so long building needed to be launched, and launched it was. Omar found her there one afternoon in the 3rd month after the refit, standing in the doorway in the way she stood there, and he came and stood beside her with the ease of someone who had been in enough of her specific silences to know what kind they were. "My youngest drew me something like that," he said. "Before my last deployment, house, tree, 2 figures, she was 5. Nora looked at the drawing. "How old is she now?" 11. She draws much better now. She is embarrassed by the old ones when she sees them." He looked at the drawing on the wall for a moment, and she could see him with his 3 daughters in the small photograph in his breast pocket, the photograph he had been carrying since before she knew him, the photograph that 3 daughters had posed for at some specific moment in time that had then become the permanent way he carried them. "I hope someone keeps them anyway," he said. Nora looked at the drawing for another moment. The house, the tree, the 2 figures, the person who had made it and the person who had received it, and the 40,000 years between and the corridor they were standing in. "Someone did," she said. They stood there for a while, the 2 of them, in the corridor of a ship that had been built with love by people who were ending, for people they would never meet, on the understanding that what they were doing mattered even if they could not be there to see it matter. The ship ran quietly around them, all systems, all readiness, the beautiful engineering that Omar had documented and that the Eternal Watch had maintained across 40 millennia of waiting. Outside, in the known space that had been smaller yesterday than it was today and would be smaller today than it was tomorrow, other ships moved on their routes and their errands, human and alien both, in the galaxy that had had humans in it for a very long time and was still learning what that meant. In the intergalactic void, the coordinates where the Eternal Watch had waited were empty now. The deep time stability of the space remained. The cold remained. The absolute dark remained, unmarked by any vessel or any presence, exactly as it had been for 40,000 years before the Eternal Watch arrived there, and exactly as it was now that the Eternal Watch had left. The ship had done what it was built to do. It had waited, and it had been found, and it was home.